So before we get to the topic of the Russian submarine that was destroyed in Novorossiysk, costing between 300 and 400 million dollars, quite a pretty penny. Mind you, this is Novorossiysk, the port that was the safe harbor for the Russians in Sevastopol that were fleeing because the Ukrainians in Odessa were able to continue launching attacks, missile attacks, drone attacks, and sea drone attacks were just damaging them too much. So they moved over to Novorossiysk in order to get safe harbor. And now that safe harbor is now under threat, which then throws into the question of, is there any safe harbor for the Russian Black Sea Fleet in the Black Sea? We'll get to the answer to that in a little bit. But first, I want to talk about the situation on the front line. So the big positive news for the Ukrainians, of course, has not changed. It is the situation around Kupansk, where the Ukrainians have taken back the majority of Kupansk. They have pressed the Russians out of the northern advance. They have encircled what is estimated to be roughly 200 Russians in Kupansk. Now, this number has a huge asterisk on it, of course, because there's no solid sources from the Russians saying we have these many people encircled. But since the Russians were pushed out of the out of the west of the city, and they were pushed out of the north of the city and pressed to the Osko River, the Russians in the city center have been under increasing pressure, and more of the city center has been lost to the Ukrainian advance, and more Russians have been lost as well during that process. And if you look in the city center of Kupiansk, the damage is quite immense due to the fighting, but the Ukrainians are on the pathway to taking back the city center. The problem is if the Russians try to throw more attacks, more infantry to try to reestablish a connection, maybe they could achieve that. But then the same problems that existed for the Russians logistically when trying to cross the Osko River that put them in this position in the first place will still exist. And then the question will be for Russian command, is this a fool's errand? Is this looking at it like a sinking ship and you're just investing more and more into a project that will never succeed unless you had an immense amount of troops that is currently spread out all across the front line, and the Ukrainians didn't have the determination to keep Kupiansk in their grasp. But currently, that doesn't seem to be the situation. The situation may change while the Russians are encircled here temporarily. That could be different in the future, but for the time being, the Russians have not been able to muster a counteroffensive in order to break the Ukrainian counterattack that has retaken most of Kupiansk and has cut off many Russians in the city center and pushed the Russians towards the Osko River and in some cases over the Osko River. Okay, so that's the situation in Kupiansk. The situation in Konstantinivka is not much different. There's like a few locations around here, around some of this forestry area that is more solidified as Russian controlled. But when it comes to the south of the city where the Russians have infiltrated before, there's no evidence that the Russians have been able to strengthen their control of that area that I could find. The Ukrainians are doing drone attacks in that area. They are busting up the Russians, trying to infiltrate the city from different sides. But the city has been surrounded with barbed wire and entrenchments that is making it so that every entrance can come with a problem unless they can find penetrations like where they have cut barbed wire and they have done the engineering work to actually clear a way for infantry. And the areas that they have done that, many times the Ukrainian drone pilots discover those areas, concentrate fire on those areas, and then you lose a lot of infantry before they can even do the difficult house clearing work, or just before they even do house clearing, infiltrating into the city itself. It's difficult to use this overwhelming infantry advantage to get into the city. It's very loss intensive. And while at the moment the Russians are taking heavy losses, they are slowly encroaching on the on the southern side. They are encroaching here quite slightly, and of course, the battles around Chasiv Yar that have been ongoing for years are still continuously ongoing. Konstantinivka is a place that is hell on earth for the civilians that are still there at this point. Okay, Prokrovsk. Any remaining Ukrainian forces are in the north. It's very rare that you see any Ukrainians in the city center at this point. You could say that Prokrovsk is probably 80 to 90% controlled by the Russian army. When you talk about Mirorod, the situation is a little bit more complicated. Well, the south of Mirorod is now 100% controlled by the Russians. The Ukrainians have pulled out of that area. How many troops were lost by holding these tree lines, these villages, longer than maybe was necessary, I do not know, but they are out now. They have pulled out, and the Ukrainians in Mirorod are facing a situation that I would describe as hellish. I actually have some footage to show the situation both in Prokrovsk and Mirorod. First, I'll show the footage from Prokrovsk, which right now, again, is 80% controlled, 80% occupied by the Russian army. And then I'll show you some footage from Mirorod. First, here is the footage from Prokrovsk. This is from Russian state media. You see, many of these cities have been cut in half. We'll turn off the music because I don't want to be copyrighted and give any of my ad revenue to the Russians. I am, no, thank you. You can see many of the buildings have been cut in half. Those were most likely done by glide bomb strikes. Those are the munitions that have the most power to do strikes like that. Many of these strikes could have been done by cumulative bombardments. While one grad strike or one artillery strike will not tear a building in half or destroy those many layers of homes, multiple strikes, depending upon them being Ukrainian positions or just multiple artillery strays hitting the same location, can do immense damage. But most of those times it's torn straight in half. It's going to be a glide bomb strike. That's the only thing that can be delivered within that many kilograms of explosive to do that much damage. You can see a lot of these buildings were burnt out. When I was evacuating last time I was in Prokrovsk City, I saw the buildings burning behind me. A lot of times a grad rocket will hit a location, and while the grad rocket will do minimal structural damage, maybe it will destroy and cave in one or two apartments, it'll hit something like it could be a piano, it could be a bed, it could be anything that's flammable, books, and then a fire will start, and before you know it, an entire apartment complex could be caught in flames. And in that period, there were still civilians in the city. There are still some civilians in the city now, but all of them are living underground, and they're very few and far between. But Pokrovsk is now a husk of its former self. The vast majority, 98 to 99, I would say 99% of the population now is, of course, gone. Anybody that remains, again, is living underground, waiting for the fighting to cease. Even at this point where the Russians control 80% of the city, the danger will continue for civilians as the shelling and drone attacks will continue. Many Russian positions are now within the city. And while this is damaged, this is a city that is destroyed, you can say this is the corpse of Prokrovsk. The Russians have no difficulty setting up military positions in the corpse of cities. I mean, the city was probably murdered long ago. As for Mirorod, which there is probably more Ukrainian soldiers in at this point than in the city of Prokrovsk itself, even though it's a very unenviable position due to where it's being pushed from multiple sides, it looks very unenviable to be an infantryman in Mirorod right now.
Може, трохи.
We're not going to listen to the music, but you can see the massive destruction in Mirorod. Many buildings hit by COB strikes again and again and again because it was estimated there to be military positions in those areas. The thing is, when you look throughout the city, a lot of those places were positions maybe for a little bit or were not positions for that long. But if you look through some of these locations where Ukrainian soldiers have to navigate, it's popular routes of navigation, so they get striked regularly due to artillery. Buildings that are well known to have Ukrainian military in it, so there's going to be multiple cap strike locations, and so you could find areas where the Ukrainian military is most active. Quite frankly, it looks like Godzilla or some gigantic tsunami or natural disaster just swept through. It just was the Russian army's bombardment. And so that's the situation right now in Pokrovsk and Mirorod. The other location that I think I want to bring some attention to, while there were some minimal Russian gains in this area, specifically near here, that I think are notable, the thing that I'm most immediately worried about right now is Huliaypole. While this hasn't been updated in a day, there is reason to believe that the Russians are also infiltrating to the south here of the city, and so they're pushing it from the south, they're pushing it from the north, and this two-pronged attack when there really isn't much dividing Russian positions from the south here, especially if they want to attack more from the south, for pressure here and not just to the east south, but to the south period. Then I don't know how long Huliaypole can hold up. This location wasn't thoroughly prepared to be defended, but also there's a question about if it's thoroughly manned, as there's manpower questions, manpower problems everywhere. I spent a very small amount of time in Huliaypole. I crossed through it. It's Nestor Makhno's ancestral home. The people there are very nice. But the main thing that the Ukrainian command is going to be concerned about, besides of course Huliaypole itself, is the positions behind Huliaypole. There is not many other large urban locations between Huliaypole and Orikhiv, which is the other big defense node and has been probably one of the biggest defense nodes, one of the most notable defense nodes for both the attempted Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive. We did some filming in that area towards the end of the counteroffensive when we were embedding with artillery teams, but also as a defensive position, logistical hub. I mean, this is something that the Ukrainians certainly do not want flanked, because then you start seeing the entire Zaporizhia front line, I don't want to say crumble, but slowly get rolled back until you have real concerns about not only Zaporizhia being within 50-kilometer fiber optic FPV drone range. This is something that's concerning. But we're talking about artillery range. The loss of Huliaypole is going to be a disaster for Huliaypole. It's going to be a disaster for all of these villages behind Huliaypole. It's going to be a disaster for the villages north here. It's going to mean probably more pressure eventually on the not only the Zaporizhia region, but the Dnipro region as well. But the pressure on Orikhiv is probably one of the most immediate security crises that will follow, that leads direct to a crisis in Zaporizhia. So the Ukrainians are interested in holding Huliaypole. It's not like Huliaypole falls, you're at the gates of Zaporizhia, but there is a domino series that is being knocked out here, where if you go from Huliaypole, you can then go to Orikhiv. Then you go from Orikhiv to closer to the outskirts of Zaporizhia, and then you're at Zaporizhia. Obviously, I'm just saying go from here to there to there. There's a difference between doing that and saying that. Doing that will require tons and tons of manpower, require tons and tons of munitions, will be resisted by the Ukrainians at every step of the way. And the closer they get to Zaporizhia, the more persistent that resistance can become. But this is what the Russians are mapping out. This is where they're planning. I'm not saying that, it's as simple as doing that, but I'm saying this is the pathway the Russians see for themselves. What they see is pushing closer and closer and closer to Zaporizhia until they're within artillery range, until they can really bombard the city and then cause another mass displacement of Ukrainians to the west and threaten another Ukrainian city with occupation. Because despite all of the negotiations that we have seen so far, the Russians have yet to give up on their territorial claims for Zaporizhia. So, moving from there, I want to talk about the Ukrainian operation in Novorossiysk. As we said, Novorossiysk was a port that was used to house the Russian Black Sea Fleet after they took pretty devastating losses, not only at the start of the war, but as the war dragged on. There was, of course, the loss of the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, just the Moscow, that was taken out by a combination of drones distracting the naval gunners, the naval anti-air gunners, and missile strikes being just precise, so accurate on hitting the most integral parts of the ship, sending it to the bottom of the Black Sea. But following that, then there was the loss of a bunch of patrol personnel. There was the loss of a submarine before this. Many people may have forgotten, but this is actually not the first submarine loss for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. This is the second. Yes, the second submarine loss for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And so as time went on and these losses stacked, the Russian Black Sea Fleet commanders made the decision, and maybe even probably higher up command, for national prestige, for national honor, for national morale, on top of military usefulness, trying to preserve the operability of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, they decided to relocate from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. Now, to be clear, a big part of the reason this war is happening in the first place and I do not dispute this, is that the Russians want a naval base in Crimea. They have cultural domineering viewpoints. They have a bigger imperial viewpoint. They have this confrontational civilizational clash they have listed out in their head. There's a lot of reasons, but they did, and I know this is very base going to the very start of the war, they did want a naval base in Crimea. And while there is a lot of noise, maybe even sometimes too much noise made about that, them going back from Crimea and moving their forces to Novorossiysk, that was a bloody nose. That was humiliating for them. That was them having to accept and state to the world through their actions that they simply not only could not get naval dominance in the Black Sea, which they were unable to get within the first year of the war, but they could not, I mean, once they could not establish that the Ukrainians are no longer allowed to trade, once the Ukrainians continued trading without the Grain Corridor, it was over. It was over. Not only did they not have that naval dominance, but they could not protect critical naval assets that were a launching point for the war and from where the Black Sea Fleet is supposed to be stationed. This cultural linchpin of the invasion. You know, as much as the Z is a culturally hollow symbol, it doesn't really represent anything. It was just supposed to be like a regional command symbolization. And then it became a symbology of the war as the Russian government and Russian public desperately tried to grasp the some meaning to this, some display, some meaning to all the corpses that they were putting in the ground. Crimea, Sevastopol, the bridges that Putin had built, all of this represented the most physical demonstration of what Russia had accomplished in occupied territories, because you can't look at occupied Donetsk and see much. There's no running water in occupied Donetsk. Okay, occupied Luhansk. Luhansk was already one of the poorest regions in Ukraine. Having all the young men flee or get killed in the war has not improved the situation under occupied territory much at all. Not to mention, of course, the immense damage to infrastructure. So Crimea really was the last remaining example, and what Russia kind of pointed to as the crown gem, this crown jewel of their occupation. And for them to have to pull back from that was humiliating. But now that they've done that, and this is what's happening, despite them having to put their tail between their legs and move back there, it shows that not only do the Russians not have naval dominance in the Black Sea, not only do the Russians not have protection in Sevastopol, but they also don't have protection in Novorossiysk, and that could mean that they have no safe harbor whatsoever. Here is the footage of the attack that was done by an SBU Sea Baby drone, which, by the way, most of the attacks that have been done have not been done by the SBU. Well, the Sea Baby drones get the most attention and because they have a lot more, I'll say they're a lot flashier, they have a lot more gadgets. And I think the term Sea Baby, to be frank, kind of caught on better than the names of the other models, right? So the Sea Baby drones may have not gotten the majority of the kills. It's usually other models. I would primarily point towards GUR, military intelligence, and their naval drone model, which has done a lot of damage to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. This is one you can actually, attribute to the SBU. So this is an achievement of them. So the vast majority of the damage was done to a Russian submarine here. By the way, I don't choose the music, and I've already made my position known about Ukrainian press corps, the Ukrainian press officers of all different units and their primary choice of music. This wasn't the worst example, but I'm still of the hard line position that folk music should be what dominates. Okay, I think it looks classy over all of it, and it angers the Russians more than anything. But But putting that personal long-standing beef aside of why I should be the one choosing all of the Ukrainian armed forces using myself, putting that aside, this was a submarine worth between 300 and 400 million dollars that was now at this point deemed to be largely disabled, largely deemed inoperational. Now, that doesn't mean that this submarine could never be fixed or never could be repaired. The Russians have their aircraft carriers like combust and catch on fire like 5 days out of the week. And they'll get out there, they'll take the fire extinguisher, they'll take out some tape, and, get that thing out there again, get it out there. We need to stay an aircraft carrier nation, okay? We got to keep the street cred. We can't let everybody in the neighborhood hear that our aircraft carrier is basically held together with toothpicks and chewing gum at this point. So I think they could maybe fix it up, but they're not going to have it fixed up by the end of this war. They're not. So I would deem that the submarine is inoperational for the rest of the duration of the war, if it will ever be operational again. Now, that is quite a lot of damage to be done by quite an inexpensive drone. Now, I said on Twitter that this is quite a lot of damage that you could do with a $50,000 drone. And somebody said in the responses, oh, this drone specifically was probably over, a few $100,000. And yes, that is true, but missing the point. It's not that this specific drone is, $100,000, $200,000. If the drone was $1 million, if it was $1 million drone, and we're talking about a $300 to $400 million submarine, the defense economics of it already works. But we're talking about something that's half of that. The defense economics massively improves. But we're talking about something that in the most is $100,000 to $200,000, maybe $250,000 if you wanted to put on every bell and whistle in the world on it. But I think that's also the SBU being the SBU and kind of being a little extra with it, which they tend to be. Point is, you could probably get it even more inexpensive than it is now, and the defense economics is always going to work. $100,000, $200,000. If they wanted to upgrade it further and make it $300,000, this is so inexpensive in comparison to the damage that it does. You lose 10 of these at sea, and just one of them gets through and hits that submarine, and then all of it works. The defense economics is overwhelmingly positive. You miss 20 of them, in the defense economics if it works. You would have to miss so many of these drones for it to not work out from a defense economics perspective that you would have to be literally, you'd have to be Stevie Wonder, the drone pilot. You'd have to be one of the worst operators in the name of the game for this not to work out for you from a defense economics perspective. So the question is there enough defense infrastructure to produce these at a quantity to keep adding these losses on the scoreboard? Well, I don't know how much more they're going to invest into naval drone production. I think, of course, they're going to keep operating these drones. They're going to keep producing these drones. But there's a lot of areas in Ukraine right now that is an urgent need of capital. The entire drone sector in Ukraine is in need of capital. The heavy bomber sector is in need of capital. The recon sector, from fixed wing to Mavic, is in need of capital. The FPV drones are in need of capital, but also the FPV bomber drones, which get less attention, but I think should get a lot more attention. I really do think they're going to be the future of the battlefield. They need capital. The entire Ukrainian drone sector, despite its massive size and continued growth, needs capital. So I don't know how much of that capital is ultimately going to end up at the feet of either the SBU's naval drone program or the military intelligence agency's drone program. But even if they stay at current rates of production or just have modest increases at the very least, which is what I would expect, this is not sustainable for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The longer this goes on, the worse state it's likely going to be in. And so I don't expect at any point in this war, unless there is a massive technological transformation here when it comes to how drones can be countered by naval vessels, for the Russians to be able to regain naval dominance and the Ukrainians might leave the battlefield depending upon how much longer this war drags on. If this war drags on for another year or two, we'll really be asking what will be left of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. If they can continue these attacks and there is no other safe harbor, because if they're not safe in Sevastopol and they're not safe in Novorossiysk, where is the Russian Black Sea Fleet safe? And I don't think they're necessarily safe anywhere. And any location I could think of that they could, they can move, well, they can take the patrol ships and they can move them to this port, and they can take these ships and move them to that port. Any conclusion I could come to say, well, this is another 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers, another 10,000 or 20,000 invested in any one of these drones in time and research, and I don't see that benefiting the Russians long term. Even if they move away further from Novorossiysk, they try to go further down the coastline, which they could attempt to do. And it's not as simple as you just snap your fingers and you turn a fishing port into, a naval port that can sustain an operational fleet. But putting all of the logistics aside, even if they achieve that, it wouldn't be that long until we're talking about probably a Ukrainian, not only aerial drone attack, which all of this is in the range of, but more Ukrainian naval drone attacks. So I don't know if they're going to move their assets out of Novorossiysk. Maybe they'll start rotating them out, operating them, putting them out to sea to try to stop them getting. But even that of course comes with danger. They can be hit out at sea. I don't really know how much that does. Of course, it's not a static target. All we really know is that there probably is no safe harbor for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And due to the fact that they're kind of just trapped in there due to international obligations and how the Turks see the situation, and the Russians not being able to just produce a bunch of new boats on the coastline to make up for the losses for whatever they can accomplish, it's going to be probably worse for them the longer this goes on. And this is probably one of the most significant, no, this is the most significant military victory of the Ukrainians that has been the most overwhelming. From the naval perspective, the Ukrainians have dominated considering the power disparity at what they had going into this. Oh, by the way, let me read this beautiful post from Russian Telegram channels. As of course the most reliable source, the most name in war reportings. We're not like that anyway. This is in response to how bad this is going to be for Russia. We'll keep enduring it anyway. Russia is a land power. The most important thing for us is that the infantry doesn't run out. In the end, they'll pull through. They'll also solve the issue with Ukraine's access to the sea. And as for the price, we won't back down on the price. Is this not the equivalent of a white flag on the naval front and now putting all your eggs in the basket of the endless infantry assault front? What happens if those infantry volunteers run out and you have to turn to mobilization, which is politically difficult? What happens if the funding for these operations does not turn up? For example, I wanted to show you guys actually something that Andrew, a colleague of mine, showed, which is not, he doesn't work at Offbeat, but we both covered the war. Him from straining his eyeballs, looking at endless OSCENT streams of information for his Ukraine maps and his listing of losses. Me through going over there and deciding this is what I'm going to do with my life. Right here is footage or a screenshot of footage of a Russian assault on a Ukrainian tree line where the BMP comes up, the Russian BMP, Russian soldiers attempt to dismount, Ukrainian soldiers get up and they start firing at them as they attempt to dismount. They're getting shot, falling, it's not going great for the Russians. And as the Russians are trying to, hit the ground and scramble to do something, and they start taking out grenades to start throwing, that BMP doesn't do anything. Its gun doesn't turn, it doesn't fire. In fact, that gun stays static and does not move at all, which suggests to me not the idea that, wow, the Russian BMP operator was so incompetent, or they don't know what they're doing, they can't drive, or they're drunk, or any amount of aspersions you could try to throw out to I don't know, please the hordes on Twitter. I think the most likely scenario, as Andrew pointed out, is that they just couldn't. is that the BMP turret didn't work, that this was a chassis that they were able to mobilize and get moving, and those infantry decided, or at least command decided, that maybe they had a better chance moving a little faster on the top of a BMP that they could jump off of, and that the driver had a better chance than if they were to all either go on motorcycles or, just wing it and go on foot. And if Russia is at a state where they're just sending unoperable BMPs with a gun that does not work under the hope that the grenades that the infantry can throw once they get there will be enough to see them through, then that means the Russians are in a desperate place infantry wise. And putting all your eggs in that basket when the infantry cannot receive the support necessary to achieve the goals that Russia set out for them might not be not only intelligent, but you can call it a fool's errand.